Sounds great. All right. So without further ado, I'm going to kind of hand it over to Frank Lopez. He is a coach and a consultant for nonprofit organizations, and he's going to be talking to us today about strategic planning in the times of uncertainty. So, Frank, thank you so much for joining us today. Again, sorry for our technical difficulties, but we're excited to hear from you and hear what you have to say. So I'm going to go ahead and spotlight you so everyone can check you out, and then we'll kind of go from there.
Sure. So, can I, just because it's a small group and I'd like to have conversation actually. So I'm wondering if people don't mind going on screen so I could see who's in the room instead of so that would be great. Hey, Trish, it's great to see you.
Great to see you. I knew you were going to say that, Frank. I would say the same thing if there was like a small group.
Marlene, thank you for plugging in. Yeah. So if others can come on, and I understand sometimes folks are getting ready or got kids or got pets or eating or stuff. So I understand when people aren't on screen. So why don't we, I want to first thank Jermaine Mitchell for the invitation to share a few words and thoughts today. So I want to begin with that. And maybe what I'd like to do is just give you a tiny little bit of my background, and then really at one point open it up to conversation and questions. But just a little bit of my background. So I've been working with nonprofits almost since college. So easily over 25, 30 years. And especially in the last 15 years, have done a lot of capacity building. Capacity building is helping organizations get better and stronger. So I've done a lot of capacity building type work. Have easily worked with thousands of nonprofits and hundreds of executive directors in California, Texas, and New Mexico. I come from the southern part of the state, so and I have a business background, a law background. I've also worked for a very large foundation. I've worked with many foundations. But because I have a business background and a nonprofit background, I feel like I've got two sort of like perspectives on how a nonprofit works or doesn't work. And I've seen many nonprofits succeed with great success, and I've seen many fail. And I'm happy to share some of that experience. And that's what really shaped some of my thinking. Typically in the strategic planning phase, there's some typical items that are discussed in strategic planning, but I like to actually talk about the people part of strategic planning. So typically in a strategic planning session, I think everyone in this call knows the group will discuss mission and vision, often engage in a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. We'll set major goals, may determine a budget, maybe engage in the fund development component in the strategic planning session. But really what I'd like to focus today, more than those things, is the human side of planning. And I'm going to start that conversation with a story about, now I think it's been maybe 6, 7 years ago. So this is before COVID. I was leading a session on strategic planning, and this was a training. So it was a workshop on how to do strategic planning, and it included budget analysis. But in the middle of the workshop, and it was a small group, so there's about maybe 15 to 20 executive directors in the room. But in the middle of the workshop, so this is a technical workshop, in the middle of the workshop, one executive director asked, I'm having a hard time being a leader, especially balancing my home life. And then she went on to describe, a family situation she was dealing with. And then she went on to say, to be an executive director, I have to lead my staff and at the same time work with my board. And sometimes I can't talk to my board because they don't understand what I'm going through. And sometimes I can't talk to my staff because I'm supposed to be the strong one and the leader. And when that executive director brought up her challenge, what I would call a life challenge, it turned a corner for the whole workshop, because then other executive directors say, well, I'm having a challenge with this. And then another executive director in the room said, I feel alone. And then he went on to say, it's not a matter of being lonely. I just feel aloneness, like I'm isolated as an executive director. And so that workshop, so the remaining part of that workshop went from being very technical to being more of a conversation on leadership and balance and just the struggles of being a leader with a nonprofit organization. So that was pre-COVID. That was a conversation pre-COVID. What that workshop led into are some self-care workshops and then more discussions with executive directors on the challenges of being an executive director. We can fast forward to today, and if we had a session on a strategic planning session today, now that COVID is here and real, I would venture to say that there would still be in the back of people's minds, while we would be talking about strategic planning and mission and goal setting and the SWOT analysis, while we would be talking about that, in the back of people's minds, there would be, I've got a family situation, I've got a child that's sick, I've got a dad that my staff is struggling with X, Y, and Z, or I have one staff member that's not getting along with another. So in the back of a person's mind in the strategic planning session are a number of other things. And I didn't even mention COVID, because that's present too. I'm going to share just 3 examples, and then I want to get into a little bit of sort of like the human side of how we work through this. So about 4 years ago, maybe 5, I was working at a foundation, and one of our grantees, who's also a friend of mine, an executive director, called me and said, Frank, the COVID was hitting. COVID had just hit, and Albuquerque was starting to close down. And she called and said, this COVID thing is bigger than I thought, and bigger than a lot of us thought. Our day-to-day functions have to stop, and that's going to kill us, she said. And then she went on to say, our major fundraiser is in about 2 months, and if we can't hold a major fundraiser in person, it's going to affect our funding. So that's story number 1. Story number 2 was from a friend of mine who's an elder, and he shared with me that really soon after COVID hit, that one of his neighbors passed away. And then a few days later, one of his cousins passed away. Because he was an elder, one of the leaders in the community, he was asked to help move the bodies. And he's an older guy, so he wasn't strong enough, so he brought in 2 young guys to help carry the bodies. And so they removed the bodies, and I mean, they did the whole health medical thing, but he helped carry the bodies out, and they had to wear whatever that equipment is called so that you're protected. And so that I forget what it's called. Anyway, he and the 2 young men carried the bodies who died from COVID out into his truck. And he later told me that that was emotionally overwhelming. And one of the young men who also helped carry the body out later had a breakdown. And I should add that they were asked to carry other folks too, so it was more than 2. The story number 3 is a friend of mine. We were talking about the impact of COVID was not just the economy or health or education. And I've now come to believe very firmly that the impact has also affected culture. And it's affected culture in a lot of ways. We see it in Native communities, in immigrant communities. We see it in New Mexican communities, period, where people are used to hugging. And because of COVID, we don't hug like we used to. So what do these what do these stories have to do with strategic planning? So it comes back to the human side of things. And I've now worked with, as I mentioned earlier, hundreds and thousands of nonprofit organizations and hundreds of executive directors. And the conversations that I have now are different than the conversations that I had even 3 years ago and 6 years ago. And the challenges for nonprofit leaders and executive directors are, I think, quite significant, sometimes overwhelming. Before I get into a few things specifically in this sort of like the human aspect of planning, I just wanted to share a couple of things just very quickly that I think about the social sector, the nonprofit sector as a whole. The nonprofit sector as a whole, in my mind, at times can be the most agile sector, faster than how government operates. The nonprofit sector can be faster than how business operates. And so the social sector, also known as the nonprofit sector, has people that think about others. So in our nature, and I'm going to just make this assumption about everybody in this room, it's in our nature to actually think about other people. And because it's in our nature to think about other people, we sometimes carry more than the average person out there in the world. And because of that, I think as nonprofit leaders, when we do planning, it's important that we think, how do we build ourselves up? So executive director X, how do you build yourself up as an executive director so that you're strong? And how do you build your team so that your team is strong? And by that, I mean, not only strong as a team, but strong individually as an individual, so that they can actually deal in the work in the world that we're dealing with right now. All right. I do want to open it up because I do want to have conversation here. But to executive directors, I would ask a few things to start with. Is how are you making sure that you're taking care of yourself? Remember, when you're on a plane and they say you've got to put the mask on when the masks drop, you got to put the mask on yourself first before you put it on a child or anyone else. So the first question for executive directors is, how are you ensuring that you're okay? And then I think as executive directors, we need to ask our staff, what's your stress level? Like a phrase that I used to ask my staff is, what's your stress barometer? On a scale from 1 to 10, if 10 is like really, really stressed and 1 is very relaxed, where are you on a regular basis at work? And so I want to get a sense of how people feel, because sometimes on Zoom, people may appear to be okay. But if their stress is really high, if your staff is very stressed, it's important as an executive director that you know that. Considering workload, like I think thinking about workload for staff is very critical. And then something that I used to facilitate team building sessions years ago, and it's hard to do that. It's hard to do that in the Zoom world. And you talk to the racial equity, the DEI folks, and those facilitators that have been doing this type of work for a lot of years. Zoom adds another element of challenge. And I'll say this about it, we can't, if we were all in a room, we could even do some Tai Chi. Like I would love to do Tai Chi with all of you right now. While we could do some deep breathing, and we've done that, and I'm sure some of you have done some deep breathing or even meditation kind of stuff. If you can't see everybody's body language, you can't really read everything that a person's bringing to the table. Which enters yet another space that I think becomes really important in strategic planning and really in just life in the social sector, and that's communication. Because we're in the Zoom world, we really don't communicate as well as we need to. And I'll give you some examples, sometimes before I connect with somebody, I send them an email or a text and I say, are you available at 3 o'clock? Can we do a 3 o'clock? So technology is very critical in our lives today, but it's really not enough. There's a communication gap. So while Zoom is helpful and the telephone is helpful and texting is helpful, it's sometimes and often falls short of building a real relationship. And all of us know that, if you're in a relationship, you're present, you give time, you go beyond a phone call, right? And it matters even more now with staff in this era of COVID. And then I'm going to jump to boards of directors. I think it's even more important for boards of directors and individual board members to connect with executive directors on a regular basis. And here's what I mean by that. It's like, ask, how are you doing? Because Zoom is not enough. And meeting with the board once a month or every other month, really your communication with your board members has now been reduced significantly. So before you even have a strategic planning session, I would recommend some human interaction with your staff on a one-on-one with the group on topics that are not related to work, so that you get to know the human side of who's your team. And the same with the board. That time is so critical before you get into the strategic planning, because we're talking about the humans that are the people that are gonna make this work. I'm going to, one final thing, and then I'd like us to get into some conversation, but flex time. What does flex time really mean? What does working from home really mean? And how do we as executive directors and board members really enable our staff to have a good work life at home and one that's not consuming at home so that it's overwhelming and stressful? I'm gonna pause there for a minute. Any questions on anything that I've said up to now? And maybe what I'd like to ask, and maybe we'll go with this, is does this resonate with anyone? What I've just finished sharing, does this resonate with you?
I definitely think so. One of the things that I really liked is your analogy with when you're on the airplane and they say put your mask on before your children or whatever. I think that's great to kind of think about that from an executive director position. Like, yeah, you do need to take care of yourself in order to take care of your employees and everything. And so I think that specifically resonated with me. So thank you for making that great comparison.
Sure. Anyone else?
I would say yes, everything you said resonates. I'm not going to point to anything specific, Frank, because I'm doing 4 things at once this morning. But certainly, I've always found you knowledgeable about all of this. So please continue.
Yeah. So and I'm just going to look over here, and I'm glancing at chat too. So I think, go ahead.
Okay, so what I really appreciate you bringing the topic up, it's like it's the pink elephant in the room. Even doing Zoom, mine is always dependent on whether I can get the browser to connect, because I'm using an iPad as a hotspot. And so, and I also do Zooms 24/7 now, and that's because I have been doing this for the last 5 years. I'm hooked up with people all over the world, and people in England are on a total different time zone. And sometimes they record the presentations, which is incredibly helpful. Otherwise, I mean, I may be up at 10 o'clock at night logging on, and that's their 6 a.m. in the morning. So being on shutdown, what it did for me is I do the most ridiculous things to interact with people in person. I purposely go to the store and get 2 items instead of a big basket full. Because I mean, I'm isolated at home. I live by myself. And so, yeah, but yeah, we've had to deal with it. In some ways, it's worked better for me because I could not afford to go to England to conferences or to Canada or wherever. And now the only problem is I end up with like 3 things scheduled at once. And yes, there's no person interaction. So you hit a very important part. Yeah. Thank
Thanks
you.
for that, Eve. I would add to what you just said that the danger of being on Zoom 24/7 or for the many hours that you're on is I think that does open the door for burnout for you, just because the technology is hard on your eyes. You know, just having to go through the process is not easy. So I would still recommend that somehow you have some downtime in your work if that's possible. And I know sometimes it's not possible, but I totally relate to what you just said, and I think that's something that we should all think about. And anyone else? Just looking at chat.
Yeah, one thing I would like to kind of build off of all of that is, yeah, I started a new job in May of 2020. And so I went into this position completely remote, and I didn't meet half of my organization until, almost a year after I started. And so it was really kind of difficult to build those personal connections and relationships with each other because, I mean, Zoom, you can only do so much. It's that human interaction is completely different. Then it was nice because we started doing our staff meetings in person. So I got to go in and meet everybody, face to face for a little while. But, now we're kind of reverting back, and we decided, hey, with Omicron and everything, we're going to, go back to online Zoom meetings and stuff. And so it really takes away that personal connection that we have with our coworkers and colleagues. And so it is kind of a tough time to be, to be in the workforce because I 100% agree that you're missing out on all those personal connections and everything.
Yeah, Michael, I just want to do a time check. I think I was told it'd be like about 20 minutes. I just want to make sure.
Oh, and you're good because you're our only speaker for today, so we can drag this out, or we can make this last until 10 o'clock if you would like.
Okay, so I'm just going to add a few more things and really invite questions or conversation from anyone in the Zoom room. So one thing that I think before you engage in strategic planning, it's important to see where are your people today? What's the stress level? Are they okay? And I think there's some pre-planning, if you will, before a strategic planning, really just connecting with staff, connecting with boards, just to make sure where people are at. The other thing too is that once you do have a strategic planning session, many of them are done over Zoom. So you have to think about the limitations when that happens. But I know of a number of groups that are having live strategic planning sessions. So I just wanted to put this out there for people to think about. If you do an in-person strategic planning session, I would recommend a room that's large enough for people to be 6 feet away from each other. And it just brings a comfortness to folks, and then there's some have a protocol on vaccination or having boosters and that kind of thing to make sure that people are safe. Because when people feel safe, they're able to engage in the most productive way. But I'm wondering if we could just maybe get a sense from people in the room on if you engaged in a strategic planning session recently or you're planning one, was that done in person or was it done on Zoom? And if it was done on Zoom, how effective was it? Do you prefer in person or over Zoom? Anyone want to respond to that?
I can start us off. So I work for the New Mexico Farmers Marketing Association, and we're a nonprofit that works directly with the farmers. One of the big projects that we have right now is we're trying to streamline the pipeline between the producers and then the end consumers. So we're kind of trying to connect all the pieces between the food hubs around the state, the organizations that are working with the food insecure. We're working with farmers. We're working with everybody to kind of streamline this event. So back in October, we held a retreat that was kind of like to get everybody together for this. And it was really beautiful because we held it at Seviette, the National Wildlife Refuge. They have a huge, or not a huge, but they have a very good space for these types of conferences and meetings and stuff. And the weather was so perfect that we were able to hold a good portion of the stuff outside so people could feel safer being there. Then also when we were doing it, strategic planning and everything indoors, everybody was wearing a mask. It is a scientific facility, so they had better air circulation and purification stuff. And so I think that everybody felt very comfortable working with it. And I also do think that it kind of built the camaraderie and it kind of built the trust between the different people who were involved in it, because we had started this program or this project, I don't know, maybe 8 months earlier, and it had all been strictly online on Zoom and everything. And so I really think that some of that trust was what was really, you could see being like the final result from the meeting in person. And so we were able to kind of like plan the next steps for how to work on this project and everything. And so it was in person, but we definitely took the steps to make sure that everyone felt safe. We did also do like a hybrid version. So if people didn't feel comfortable attending in person or they were unable to, they were able to still participate online. And so we tried to make it as open and welcoming for everybody, make sure that they could do it. So I think kind of that's probably maybe how we're moving forward, because it's, I think it's important to offer it online to people who can't make it in person for whatever reason. But also I think like having that in-person camaraderie building is important.
Did you all do an evaluation? How did people feel about the in-person versus Zoom, or were there any thoughts on the hybrid version that you all did? Yeah.
I know that evaluations were done. I don't know what the results of those were. I didn't get the results, but I do know that the people who attended in person felt like they got a lot more out of it than the people who were doing hybrid. And I think some of that could have been to be attributed to just technical difficulties and issues, because it's a lot more complicated if you have a room with 15 people in it and you have 4 people online. Like if they want to ask a question, you have to go through a moderator and so forth. So it kind of complicates things a little bit. But yes, I don't directly have an answer for that. But
yeah, no, that's fine. Anyone else? In-person strategic planning sessions versus Zoom? Phil, are you opening up there?
Yeah, I was going to say recently, but probably a year ago now, run a Zoom strategic planning session for a nonprofit. And the main problem with the nonprofit was that the people that were working for the nonprofit weren't communicating very well with the board. So they asked me if I would come in and help bridge that gap between the two of them. So I had two problems. One, they were in Pennsylvania and I'm in New Mexico. And secondly, it was COVID, so nobody was really meeting anyway. And I kind of sat down and discussed the situation with the CEO and the lead executive of the nonprofit. And I decided to go through a SWOT with the board of directors. And what I wanted to do was get feedback from the complete board of directors on what they thought was and was not happening with regard to the organization. And so this was kind of my first foray on a Zoom strategic planning process. And so what I did was I wanted to make sure that they really understood what a SWOT was, how a SWOT worked. And I mean, I'm assuming people know, but you can break down a SWOT vertically and horizontally, inside and outside the company. There's a lot involved in a SWOT. It's not just 4 boxes. And so I conducted an hour's training session with the board of directors and said, this is how you complete SWOT. And I gave them live examples. I often do SWOT analysis with Harvard Business School. And so I keep all the analyses that I do, and I put up a couple of examples of how, when you're going through a SWOT, if you approach it properly and correctly, with any thoughts that you have, because there's no limitation on what you can put onto a SWOT or what you think about. And I said, if you get it in the wrong boxes, that doesn't really matter, because I can transfer it to the right boxes. But what I want to get is all your feelings and all your personal gripes, if you like, about what's not happening between the board and the executive. And a long story short, it turned out very well. I got replies from all of the board of directors. I compiled those onto a master SWOT. I subcategorized them into management, finance, markets, legal, those kind of things. And over the last year, we've been working through that SWOT, and it's turned out very well. The relationship between the board of directors, the chairman of the board, the chairman of the organization, and the executives on the organization is much, much better. And so I run a SWOT 2 about a month ago now. And SWOT 2, when you look at SWOT 2, SWOT's a very visual document. It's very powerful. When you've got it completed and you look at it, you can tell if you've got a majority of comments or attributes on the left-hand side, then you know you're doing okay. And if it's on the right-hand side, then you know you've got a problem. The SWOT 1 was complete had more attributes on the right-hand side. SWOT 2, we've got everything, or not everything, but a lot of stuff moved onto the left-hand side. And so that worked out very well. So I think it's doable over Zoom and over distance. You just have to make sure the people at the other end actually understand what they need to do to give you input, and then you make sure it's in the right categories, and then you can feed back to them.
Phil, I'm going to add, going back to the question, how do you think your group, how large was your group? So you facilitated that SWOT session, I'm guessing.
Yep.
How large was the group? And that was online through Zoom?
Well, we had 2 of the executive from the organization, and there were 6 board members and the chairman, so 7.
Okay. Just one of the questions I was asking the group is, what are your thoughts on how do you feel doing the planning session or the SWOT analysis online, is it just as effective, you feel, as if you had done it in person? Is there a difference? Would there be a difference for you?
Yeah, when I do SWOT in person, I feel more interactive with the people that are sitting down in front of me. And you can, yeah, I like the interaction of face to face, and I like having a whiteboard or something to actually show examples when you're actually doing a SWOT with people. So when I was asked to facilitate this organization, I had to think about how I was going to do that. And so I guess the main difference is I managed to bring out a completely separate 1-hour devoted training session on how you complete a SWOT, right? And gave them examples, like I said, from what I've run with Harvard on different attributes that they can put into the SWOT. There's no limitation. I found both ways now, having done both ways, I don't find it a hindrance. I just think you have to be very clear from the outset with people that are remote and online, exactly what you're asking them to do and what you're asking them to fill in, and so you get, and the time frame that they have to do it, so you get that back, and then you can work with them.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just gonna share a few wrap-up thoughts and then pass it back to Michael Green. But I think you said a couple of things, Phil, that I want to touch on. One is when you do have the group in front of you, there's the interaction is different, and you can actually sometimes have more interaction. The other part too that we miss because we do Zoom so often now is even just the body language of how engaged someone is or how not engaged they are. And so you can work with that in the in-person piece. But I think just to share a few wrap-up thoughts, as we do our work in the social sector, in the nonprofit sector, it is doable to do it by Zoom, and we've all done it. And Phil just gave us a great example just a minute ago. The part that I want to emphasize is the need to ensure that we're connecting with our staff, and the need to ensure that we're connecting, that board members are connecting with executive directors are connecting with board members, and the whole group is actually operating as a team. I think sometimes the remote work isolates people, and when we're isolated, sometimes we're not at our best. And I think ultimately in strategic planning, the whole goal is to bring group thinking together so that there could be some strong goal setting and ultimately a plan to really bring the organization to great success despite the world that we're living in. Just a couple of last minute things. I have found that the more that we talk about why we do our work, the more we talk about collaboration, the more engaged people get. And so I'm just leaving you with that thought and with appreciation for the work that you do. I think anyone who's doing nonprofit work in the social sector is doing amazing things, and just a lot of gratitude to you. So I'm going to close with that and just pass it back to Michael.
Thank you, Frank. And I guess before we end everything, there was a question in the chat for you. And it says, how can folks identify who in the group is not willing to focus on the group's task? I think that's kind of referring to, when you're in just any type of strategic planning meeting.
How? Say the question again.
It's how can folks ID who in the group is not willing to focus on the group's tasks? I guess, Eve, if you want to clarify that at all, feel free to unmute yourself.
Well, sometimes in groups, I mean, understand I'm like 67 years old, so I've been in lots of groups, nonprofit and profit. Some people are there, but they're not there. They didn't bring their heart to the group. They didn't. Does that make sense? I'm about to lose my internet, it says. So, I mean, he kind of answered it, but I think on Zoom, it's really hard to assess that about people. How motivated are they? Maybe Phil could assign them tasks to do and figure out, did they do the task? Does that make sense?
I think you bring up a very valid point there. What I did notice a big difference between the Zoom, my first Zoom, and doing it live is people are, if you've got a Zoom and you're trying to get feedback from individuals, then you're more likely to get back what they want to tell you because they're writing it down and sending it to you. Whereas if they're sitting in a room, they're afraid that if you're within an organization, they really don't want to say too much about what's going on over there because they're sitting over there. And this is one of the problems when you're doing any kind of strategic planning, especially if you've got divisions within an organization. Some people don't want to speak too much about what's going on on the other side of an organization. And that is a downside. That is something that when you're physically there, you really try and have to drag that out of people. Whereas doing it Zoom remote wise, they're quite willing to write it down. And I think that's one of the reasons that we were very successful in getting such a short time, getting that communication much improved with that organization.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. All right. Let's see. Do we have any other questions for Frank this afternoon or this morning? Cool. All right. Well, I want to say thank you to everybody for being patient with our technical difficulties that we had this morning. I really appreciate you kind of riding through the storm with us and still attending this afternoon. I think this was a very informative session and I really appreciate it. I would love to have Frank back again in the future to maybe do kind of a follow-up on this. Hopefully we'll have more people join us, but I think that this was very, very successful and it was nice because it was interactive and we were able to like chat and communicate with each other. Frank, if I can have you put your contact information in the chat so that way anybody can follow up with you afterwards if they have any questions, because I think that you do definitely have a lot of knowledge and expertise that you can help kind of guide some of these conversations. So I thank you for that. Let's see. The next Impacting Coffee will be on February 1st, and we'll be hearing from Evan Voth from Albuquerque Center for Hope and Recovery. So if you guys are available on February 1st at 9 o'clock, I would encourage you to join the show. It's always a wonderful opportunity to connect with people in the nonprofit community around the state. So I guess that wraps it up for today. Thank you again for all the audience members for joining us, and a special thanks to Frank for sharing all of your knowledge and expertise with us this morning. So yeah, thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks.